Hello, my name is Jorb. I love gear. I'm very excited to introduce to you the Boss SL-2 slicer. The slicer is a sort of rhythmic multi-effect. Start thinking of tremolo, but with more dynamic patterns, add some options for sophisticated stereo movement, throw in filtering or other flavors of modulation as part of the preset patterns, and you've got the slicer. If you haven't heard of the slicer effect, Roland or Boss interchangeably have referred to an effect as slicer all the way back to things like the SP303, along with a few like mixers and DJ gear of that early era, but eventually in 2006 Boss releases a pedal that is a more flexible version of that same effect, a standalone twin pedal called the SL-20 slicer. Jump 10 years past that, it is 2016. I'm very actively buying and selling guitar pedals, and I end up with an SL-20 as part of some package deal. I think I was buying somebody's entire board, but I wasn't really seeking it out. I just ended up with it, and I really ended up falling in love. I was playing guitar in a band at the time, and what I really remember doing and being impressed with is sending big reverby sounds through it, so things that were, you know, sustaining for a long time, putting on one of the stereo spread modes, and having that just spin around the room. So cool. I loved it. I raved about it, honestly. I was telling people about this totally underrated piece of gear from an era that didn't really produce anything else like it, let alone that many things that were exciting. Anyway, one more time skip. It's 2022. I have long since sold my original slicers, both. Actually, I had two for a long time. I'm now a synth man. I get an email from Boss asking if I would be interested in talking about an upcoming pedal. I, of course, said yes, and immediately started speculating. My mind was just racing. I was trying my hardest to guess what it would be and what sort of thing they would ask me to show off, and never in 1,000 years would I have guessed it would be a reissue or an update to the slicer. It is so specifically personally exciting to me, the slicer is, and it seems sort of like something Boss would never revisit, certainly in a standalone pedal. So whatever brought this idea back to the table, a dedicated individual, some market research, whatever, I'm so happy that it happened, and I'm really grateful that Boss asked me to be a part of it. So yes, they sent me the pedal, and they're actually sponsoring the video as well. That means that they're paying me for the time it takes to make the video, not for any of my opinions. So thank you, Boss, for letting me be a part of something that does sincerely mean a lot to me. To my subscribers and my patrons, really appreciate your support. You guys are really what keeps me doing it. If you aren't either and you like what I do, I encourage you to consider supporting me in whatever way fits for you. Okay? Okay, no more exposition. I want to make some sounds. How about a tour of the SL-2 over on the table, or really off of the table, because it's just resting on my Juno, which is going directly into the slicer. The slicer is then going stereo out into my mixer, and that's all you're hearing. So I'm going to set up everything about at noon. Okay, and I describe the slicer as a rhythmic multi-effect. It does a lot of things, but they all have a rhythm that's always tied to a tempo, and that tempo is always tied to some sort of a pattern, some sort of a variation. And if we start our understanding with tremolo, it's pretty easy to extrapolate. So here's my sound right now, just on the Juno. Nothing crazy. And if I turn on the slicer, we're on the tremolo type, but variation 1. And that will help me explain these sort of parameter knobs a lot easier. Balance goes from your dry signal to just the effect. And I'm sorry, it's so hard to get to these knobs in a way that you can still see it on the camera. But the top labels are the top ones, and the bottom labels, you guessed it, are the bottoms on these two stacked pots. I hope this is at an angle where the stacked pots are clear. I think it is. Anyway, we have tempo and balance. And balance goes all the way from dry to affected. So here's totally dry to totally affected. and our tempo. You, of course, know exactly what that's going to do. Here, we have sort of options to change the waveform of that tremolo or that pattern. The top is our attack control. All the way to the left, it fades in. All the way to the right, it's very abrupt. Different shapes of our LFO, which makes perfect sense coming from the synth world, doesn't it? So much more abrupt when we have attack to the right, gradual when we have it to the left. Okay, and the bottom of this stacked pot is duty. That's how much for a given step or a given point in the cycle that our sound is active, or how long that portion of the LFO or that waveform is. And that didn't make much sense. Let me just show you. So at full duty, and as I turn it down, there's shorter blips. Less of, let's think of it as a step in a sequence, but less of that step in a sequence is taken up by our sound. You can think of that like gate length on any other step sequencer, but it's for our rhythmic effect here. Right now, it's just controlling our volume because we're set to tremolo. But between these two, we have really, really flexible control over the actual shape of this LFO, over the shape of this pattern. But of course, this isn't just a tremolo, and these patterns aren't just cyclical. So even just on the tremolo type here, if I go through variations, I hope you're listening in stereo. This one's stereo. This one has some filtering. This one has some additional filtering. This one has filtering. This one has what sounds like a flanger or a phaser. This one's pulsing sort of doubly. So cool. And I start with the tremolo type because they're the simplest, but I'm going to go back to the first variation on the first type, the single slicer, and let's listen. Already that's not evenly cyclical. It changes over the course of its cycle, and this is already totally unique. I don't know anything else that does that. And that, to me, is what I think of first when I think of the slicer. I think of patterned tremolo. And you're implying these rhythms in so many ways. And it's probably not fun for me to just like go through all the types and all the variations, but I will show you sort of what you can expect from them. It's organized a little strangely, and the manual doesn't have like names for each of what you're hearing, but that's kind of the fun, and there's an element of exploration and like, you know what, I'm just going to click through until I find a pattern I do like, which is how a lot of people would use it anyway, so I don't feel like it's a huge loss. I, because I'm a tweaker, would like to see either a description or a visualization of what the pattern is going to be, so I can remember them or find certain ones that I remember liking. Anyway, point being, in single one here, which is the very first one, you're mostly getting patterned control over volume. Okay, and you don't have much control over it otherwise, but if I already go to type 2, already the second variation, that sounds like a phaser as well to me. And if I go down here, there's like bit crushing. I really like this one. That it's just implied a new rhythmic layer. It doesn't really even feel like that's affecting the Juno. It feels like parts that are sitting on top of it, which is cool and different. If I click to the next one, totally different. I hear phasers possibly again. And I feel like this is the way the slicer does normally get explored. You just like, oh, let me try another one. Oh, that's cool. Maybe that will become the core of another track. Slow rising filter. Okay, how about the very last variation? Tons of stuff going on, and stereo imaging. Super, super cool. Okay, I haven't even gone past the single variations yet, but here's double, and there are, you guessed it, 2 slicer patterns. This almost makes me think of a breakbeat. And if you're not listening in stereo or you need the help of the oscilloscope, you can kind of see how it's moving left and right here. I like the ones that move around in stereo. This one I don't like, but I will I will show it to you. Maybe this sounds cool on guitar, but it's not working here. No. Really interesting stereo movement there as well. Another one that I would say, like, oh, maybe that really works for you starting a song. Super, super, super cool. Let's move on to, this is tremolo again. And there's more than just tremolo in these. So I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think the derivation between the types is that clear. Like, what exactly is going to be different about single versus double versus tremolo? It isn't really super obvious. And in the manual, it just says a type that uses a single slicer effect, 2 slicer effects, a tremolo pattern, a modulated slice pattern, and slice patterns to which various effects are applied. But I hear various effects applied on some examples in each of these. This is harmonic. Definitely an element of harmonizing and pitch shifting. I like it, and I know I'm doing a lot of the same things, but that's where I think this does best, is implying a rhythm over something that didn't have it in the first place. That's all the harmonic ones. Now we're on sound effects. Phaser again. I feel like that's implying a melody as well. Oh my god. Okay, I could scroll through types and variations for a really, really long time. I'm probably going to slice through those like little vignettes. I probably don't need to show you all of those, but they get pretty wacky. Oh, see, even just there, the notes that I hit, it's you get some really interesting, really, really bold stuff. I find myself, especially with synths, wanting to stay on the single, the double, and the tremolo, and honestly, without sounding like kind of dorky about it, one of the things I think this is awesome at is implying hi-hat rhythms. So if I just put noise here, why don't we leave the chorus on the Juno? And I find something that works here. I've made a hi-hat pattern on the fly, and if I want to change it, I just change the knob here. And some of these have turned out silly. But these are easy, changing, hands-on controlled hi-hat patterns that I didn't have to write out. And I know that seems like a dorky little use of this, but that to me, right there, perfect. Great example of a hi-hat pattern. That to me is where I realize what this is good at. It's implying rhythms where there weren't already, and whether that be a dedicated rhythmic element like using it to develop hi-hats, or implying a rhythm on top of some existing sound, some component of some already existing beat. I really, really like it for that. And you saw me in the beginning plug in MIDI tempo. You can send MIDI clock into it. So I just have my TR-8 back here, which was sent to me by a viewer very graciously. Thank you very, very much to the sender of this. I really have been getting a lot of use out of it recently. But if I pick a pattern, that'll work. And I start the kick drum. Already it's like, oh, as soon as there's other elements, the implied rhythm matters a lot as to what's going on for this element of the track. And even if I just do a bass, if I just put everything on, make it nice and big, that's all I'm sending into it. And that's what it's giving me back. I think that's awesome. Bring it back to where we were. Manipulate our waveform. I think you guys get that. As soon as you incorporate even just the kick, another element like that, the power you get from implying rhythms becomes really, really clear to me. Okay, I'm going to move on to what I remember as my favorite part of the slicers I used to have, and there's sort of a sub-menu to get there. On the old one, which was like a twin pedal, it had its own dedicated button to change stereo behavior, and I remember that being my favorite. So right now, the default is fixed, and so whatever is going to come out of left and right stays on the left and stays on the right. If there's any stereo-ness implied by the variation you've chosen, that will stay the same on the left and the right for each repetition of the pattern and each step in the pattern. If it was going to be on the left in the preset, it's going to stay there. But there are a few other modes. You can do affected signal out one and the direct signal out of another, which is cool, but we're not going to show that. I'm just going to show you one. I'm going to do ping pong. So the way this works, turn the type knob to sound effects 8. That's the very, very last one. Yes, it is. Turn all the other knobs all the way clockwise. I don't know that we have to do that, but we will. And then you turn off the pedal. Oh, there's a battery in here. Well, if you guys don't know, with Boss pedals, you can turn them off by unplugging input A. That's part of the signal. They have like a break in there. And so anyway, to get to this hidden menu, you hold the on switch while plugging in. And then up here we see this. That's how we know we're in some submenu. And now with the variation knob, I get to decide a new output mode, new stereo output mode. And I'm going to go to 1, 2, 3, 4. This is ping pong. I'm going to press this. And that menu is out. We're saved. I'm going to go back to tremolo. And I hope you guys are listening in stereo. And I'm going to unplug the tempo. There we are. Notice now we're alternating left and right, and I'm going to go back to one of the single slicer variations. We're always in this bouncing between left and right. Anyway, we're going to go back in the submenu. I'm going to put it on the one I remember being the most impressed with as a younger man, which is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Is this it? Yes. It's like, God, I really wish you're listening in stereo. I really hope you're listening in stereo. It's sort of spinning around in time with the pattern. If I want to leave it on 7, hit that. We lock it in. Okay. Okay, here we are in a simpler one. And you feel feel it moving around in stereo. This is the sort of thing I was doing on my slicers, oh my god, 8 years ago, when I realized how cool it could be. If we were ever running somewhere where I could be in stereo, and I used a jazz chorus, a JC40, if I could run this in stereo with big reverb before or after it, and have this spinning around the room, and I would beg the sound guy to mic my JC40 left and right and pan them hard left and right, so I could do stuff like this, spinning around the room, all live, all with just a pedal board. That was so, so cool. Yeah, exactly like this. Imagine a college band rolls up and some kid with a pedal board at one of the only venues that would actually let me mic up in stereo. This spinning around the room. I thought it was so cool. And it is super cool now. Anyway, I could listen to that because you guys have heard me talk about how much I love stereo positioning and stereo imaging so much, and having the controls to play with it on here are really, really great. I will say, I wish that this was a larger form factor. I think it's kind of cramped with these knobs and options like that, where I think so much of the coolness in the slicer is, especially with simpler patterns, and then picking one of the complicated stereo movement options. I think that's where this really, really shines, and to have to set the knobs in a certain way, unplug, plug it back in to get there is really, really cumbersome. The best way to remember your settings is to take a picture of them and have it in there, because there are 6 things you need to remember, let alone if you need to take notes about, oh, you know what, this stereo behavior was essential to that. So as like a live tweaking thing, I think it loses a bit from being compact. I like that it's compact, because then it'll fit in more places and more people will not, give up on it just because of a problem like size. But I'm sad that it's compact because some of the really, really cool options are behind somewhat cumbersome menus. And just to get out my other little complaint, presets on this would be wonderful because of exactly the things I just described. There's a lot of settings to remember that might be essential to whatever it is you're trying to get, and not having any presets is sort of a shame. Okay, those are my 2 sort of biggest complaints. I have one small complaint about sending Midi clock in, and it only matters for certain setups. But if you have a device that doesn't have clock division on what it sends out, this does not have clock division on what it receives when you send in Midi clock. And the tempo knob does nothing. So I did send Boss an email and said, hey, I would love if while Midi clock was coming in, the tempo knob was a clock divider. That to me would add a lot of flexibility to pairing this with other hardware. Of course, there are certain examples of hardware where that is a non-issue completely, because you can change the clock you're sending out. You can divide the clock as you're sending it out. But for certain things, I can see that being a pretty major hang-up. In some ways, and I don't want anybody to get too hung up on this point, but in some ways, I see this as the sort of rhythmic counterpart to the microcosm. The microcosm is ambiance, but multi-effect, and there's some settings that you might not expect, and there's modes that do things that surprise you. This is like that, but you're not implying space, you're implying a rhythm. And while the microcosm starts with delay or granular, here on the slicer it starts with tremolo. And I think thinking of it like that is where it becomes really, really useful, really, really valuable. Because you can say, I want more ambiance on this, and grab any of the thousands of delay or reverb pedals that exist. But for adding a rhythmic element, what options do you really have? You can add a tremolo, you can add some sort of cyclical modulation, but nothing works quite like this. Nothing else adds rhythm quite like this, certainly not anything that I know of. So one last time, the slicer is such a cool thing for Boss to be putting out. Yes, to me specifically, it's so exciting to see it come back, and I hope you guys think so too. I hope you guys get a chance to check it out. I'm really happy I did. But yeah, there you go. Thanks for watching. My name's Jorb. I love gear. I love the slicer, the new one and the old one. Thanks for watching. Cheers and so long.